All right, good morning. So, today we are talking about sport and exercise psychology. Before we kind of jump into the slides here, I'd like to share a story about why I think sport and exercise psychology are vastly underrated in terms of their importance with regards to performance, with regards to uh, adherence, so on and so forth. I am a massive proponent of trying to develop people, clients, athletes, psychologically, just as or in line with how you are developing them physically. Right. So this story is it's before I even opened up my gym. It's before I started training people 8 years ago. This is probably now going back 9 years ago. About 9 years ago, I was into endurance sports at the time, and I was going to get my USA Triathlon certification. It's a weekend certification. So I drove up, I forget where, it was about a 3 hour drive, and I went to this clinic. There was probably about 20 to 30 people in the room getting certified, and there were three coaches that were doing the certification. Two of them were fairly high level triathlon coach in that they were USA level 3, I believe. So USA Triathlon level 3 coaches. And it's like the highest of the high. There was probably at the time 15 to 20 USA level 3 certified coaches in the country. All right. So, we go through the weekend, and at one point there's a lunch break, and I speak to the coach because at the time I was thinking about going back to school. At the time, I only had my undergraduate degree in business, and I was thinking about going for exercise science, but I wasn't really sure. I was a little conflicted. So I approached him. I said, I'm really into endurance sports right now. I want to be the best coach, blah, blah, blah. What do you think are the best ways to enhance my ability to coach? And I will never forget it because I was talking about going to exercise science. I was thinking about doing physical therapy. And he thought about it for, 10, 15, 20 seconds. And he said, listen, you know, exercise physiologists, exercise science are a dime a dozen. That does not really differentiate you, right? He said, if I were to redo it again, I would probably go back for sports psychology. And that kind of stuck with me. And here we are, whatever it is, 9 or 10 years later, and um, I don't know if that guy just influenced me, but I've always felt sports psychology is incredibly, incredibly important to performance. So, having said that, keep all of that in mind. Sometimes when athletes hear psychology, they think emotions, feelings, and they just kind of ignore this chapter. So don't do that. Don't do that. And I'll explain why. I use a lot of stories during this presentation, so bear with me, but I think it'll help explain the importance of this. All right. So the book, I think, kind of sets the tone, really, where it gives you some stories, and some scenarios, So think about mountain biking, right? You go mountain biking, think about like those positive feelings. You're out on a Saturday morning, feeling good, fall morning, so on and so forth. Most people are going to feel pretty damn good during that ride. Um, think about when you just started an exercise program, right? In the new year, we got the new year coming up in about 3.5 months, give or take. And most people, motivation is through the roof. What happens to gyms? New Year's, the first week of New Year's, second week, I can tell you at commercial gyms, it's terrible because they're packed, 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 packed to the brim, right? 2 months later, where did that motivation go? And why is this? Why can't people continue to adhere to their goals that they set? These were their goals to lose weight, gain muscle, whatever. But 2 months later, you see it all the time. I see it all the time. Gyms empty out 2, 3 months into the year. Um, Likewise, in terms of coaching, right? Look at a coach trying to figure out how to motivate a team that's struggling. It's not easy, as a coach. If some of you guys in this class want to be like high school, college, whatever coaches, you're down 25, 30 points in a basketball game. and or you're down whatever 20 or 30 points in a football game. There's one quarter to go, or maybe it's halftime. How are you motivating your team, right? Yeah, there's times where you're going to go into games and another team is clearly better than you, clearly, right? Not even before the game, not even during the game. If going in, the other team is better than you. How do you motivate that team, right? And then things that are a little bit more personal, as a coach, or anytime as you grow up, trying to help people cope with loss. It's inevitable where you are going to be responsible for trying to help people, right? So very important stuff. All right, so in terms of definitions, sport and exercise psychology, the study of human thought, emotion, and behavior in physical activity. So the simple way to think of it are the ABCs. Affect or mood or emotions. Okay, activity, whether it's exercise or sports, will have an effect on our mood. Again, positive or negative. And behavior, right? Like, why do we go to the gym in New Year's? What causes this? And it's really heavily dictated by our cognitions, right? Our cognitive side. Thoughts will influence, right, our physical activity habits, and are influenced by our physical activity habits, right? So how we think is going to get us to the gym, but then also when we're in the gym and after the gym, right? When you work out, you usually feel better, right? So you have these positive thoughts about yourself usually. All right, so just some clarification, right? Because sometimes people use these terms interchangeably. You should know the difference between a sports psychologist and an exercise psychologist, and it really is it's in the term, right? So a sports psychologist is going to be really looking for these psychological approaches to dealing with sports performance, right? And these theoretical bases on how to improve sports performance. Exercise psychologists might be more related towards exercising, right? So working out. So how someone interprets their body, how someone interprets or produces positive feelings post workout. Okay, so those ones should be clearly distinguished between a clinical sports psychologist. And clinical, right, equals license. A clinical sports psychologist is going to be have what we call a larger scope of practice, right? A sports psychologist might not necessarily be licensed to talk about certain things like depression, suicidal thoughts, so on and so forth. So as we start to explore, because we're now into that midway of the semester, where I said the semester is broken into thirds, where we have that early part of the semester, which is this topical overview of just kinesiology itself. This middle portion is now about certain fields, right? Today is sports psychology. There's another class where we talk about motor control and motor behavior. Then there's exercise physiology. For all of these, right, we have these methodologies or these tools to help develop research. And if you're going to get into one of these fields or many of the, or maybe you're in multiple fields, you have to know how we quantify certain things, right? So something like in my particular field, which is more exercise science or exercise physiology, we typically use much more of a quantitative method of analysis. And what do I mean by quantitative? More numbers oriented, right? So like, if we're talking about the gym, we're trying to improve back squat strength, right? We do some type of exercise intervention. We assess their back squat strength in the beginning, then they go through an exercise intervention, right? And then, make sure I'm centered here, and then we test their back squat again at the end, right? So we have these numbers. Let's say their back squat was 200 pounds and went up to 225 pounds, right? So it's a very numbers oriented field. In psychology, sports psychology, exercise psychology, it's much more what we call qualitative research. Okay, so it's a little bit more subjective. It's more about perceptions, thoughts, and emotions. And sometimes, depending on who you talk to, it might be a little bit harder to quantify because it is qualitative. Okay, so what is more of qualitative research? It's based in questionnaires. Questionnaires are very common. I'm sorry, I don't know why this is so small, but questionnaires are very common in qualitative research. With regards to our field of kinesiology, one scale that is often used is a profile of mood scale, or a POMS. You'll see this a lot on, determining the effect of exercise on mood. So they give people a profile of mood scale in the morning. Let's say they work out in the afternoon, and then they give them another profile of mood scale in the afternoon. And that's kind of, like I said, pre and post exercise. Interviews are another common sports psychological tool. The difference between an interview and a questionnaire is that an interview is going to be much more in depth, right? An interview is one-on-one, where we get a little bit deeper to the root of things. When you just give somebody a questionnaire and they kind of fill it out, it's this prefixed measurement tool, right? The questions are prefixed. An interview is going to be a little bit more open-ended, and based on what the interview is saying, the interviewer can go deeper and ask further questions. So an interview is much more in-depth. Observations are another tool to help support some of this data. Oftentimes you'll see somebody give interviews, and then they might also support that with some so they'll watch somebody working out in addition to their interviews. Now, again, this research tends to be more qualitative, but we do sometimes have some physiological measures, which makes it a bit more quantitative at times. But in general, remember, sports psychology is much more qualitative. So those physiological measures we might look at, blood pressure, heart rate, you don't really look at biochemical too much, right? They're talking about blood work and stuff in the textbook, and you'll see some content analysis, which you'll see is like a little bit more descriptive research. But the things you guys should know is sports psychology is going to be a lot of questionnaires, a lot of interviews, and a lot of observations. Got a little laser pointer here, right? These things up front. Okay. All right. So personality in sport. So the question is there a difference between athletes and non-athletes? Is there a difference in personality between athletes and non-athletes? I mean, the answer, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer, but according to the textbook and according to research, is no, right? There's not, right? In terms of personality between athletes and non-athletes, no. However, there's a difference between successful and non-successful athletes. What has differentiated LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant? What has differentiated Tom Brady? Some sporting greats, right, to non-successful athletes, these people that competed in high school football and just weren't really good, right? And these are the characteristics right here. What is the 6 characteristics? Number 1, more self-confident. And you see this very often. The people that are good have a great deal of self-confidence. Very important. Better able to cope with stress and distractions. And stress will happen. On this long athletic timeline, not everyone has this perfect linear rise to being great at a sport. They're going to have to deal with stress for sure. And in turn, they have to cope with their emotions. Attentional focus. One thing people say about Tom Brady is he just, remembers things. I've read some of his interviews, and so I think I've read his book as well, the TB12 book, where he can just, he sees a play and he sees a defensive scheme, and could think back, oh, like instantly, I saw this 2 years ago, and this is what I can expect. And sure enough, he can make adjustments based on that. That's something that's going to vastly differentiate him from a non-successful athlete. View anxiety as beneficial, right? There's people that elevate themselves at the end of a match or a game with pressure on the line, which I'll talk about in a minute. And obviously highly determined people. Right, so here I've just got some, I already said some of these names: Michael Jordan, Tom Brady, Kobe Bryant, Derek Jeter, and Kerry Strug. Some of you might not remember Kerry Strug because her story took place before most of you were born. Um, so all these people at the top are people that were able to handle and perform at the highest of levels. The YouTube video is of Kerri Strug. She was at the 1996 Olympics. Um, it was the women's team gymnastics, and the U.S. It was the final event, and the U.S. needed a specific score. I think it was like 9.4 something to win. Kerri Strug had to perform the vault. I'm not a gymnastic expert, and this is going into this. This is the absolute pinnacle of her career, right? So the pinnacle. She has trained her entire life for this moment. She has probably envisioned this numerous times. And, it's up to her to get this score. If she gets it, the USA wins the gold medal. All right? So, her first attempt, or second attempt, I forget off the top of my head, she runs to the vault, lands, rolls her ankle, and hurts her ankle pretty bad. Pretty bad. And she obviously doesn't achieve the score she needs. Third attempt, they tape up her ankle. She's banged up really bad. Goes into the vault, lands on one foot, sticks the landing on one foot, finishes the attempt. U.S. scores 9.6, 9.7, and wins the gold medal. Right? That is what I'm talking about with some athletes can elevate their game in the face of adversity or anxiety. Other athletes don't know how to cope with that. Okay, as terrible as this may sound, Lamar Odom, he was a very high-level NBA player who succumbed to, he didn't pass away, but he had a terrible drug addiction. And, while his NBA career should have lasted many more years, he was out of the NBA in probably less than 8 or 9 years because of his drug addiction. Jim Kelly, Jim Kelly and the Buffalo Bills are famous because they went to 4 Super Bowls in a row, and they lost 4 Super Bowls in a row. While Jim Kelly is a phenomenal quarterback, you lost 4 Super Bowls in a row. So some people might say that it's possible he wasn't able to elevate his game at the highest level. So another thing we have are predictors of exercise behavior, right? One is that people are confident. 2 is that people are self-motivated. And 3 is the activity trait, which is basically saying people have this desire to stay busy and constantly on the go. So, speaking to one of these, self-motivated, I often tell people all the time, I can't get you to the gym. I could do my best, and I'm not this big rah-rah guy, because you have to be self-motivated if you want to succeed. I could scream all I want, but that's not going to get you to succeed. It has to come from within. And another way to look at some of these things is the desire to stay busy, right? Sometimes people say, oh, by working out, you're much more productive. Maybe you could look at it the other way. You could look at it the other way, saying, these people that work out have this desire to stay busy. So in addition to working out, they also want to do other things, and they're much more on top of their life, checking off all their boxes of things that they have to do. But the thing to realize is that exercise and psychology feed off each other, and especially the positivity that comes from working out. When you work out, there's this feeling, the psychological feeling, right? And you have this feeling, you feel good, this euphoric feeling at times, runner's high, whatever if you want to think that's a real thing, whatever, right? And what is it? Well, our brain actually releases neurotransmitters, right? Dopamine, right, is upregulated when we exercise, and it just makes us feel good, right? So they just feed off each other, right? Post-exercise can change perception of the body, right? And even if you, I joke, but you'll see some of these like memes on the internet, right? Like somebody does like one workout, right? Then they look at themselves in the mirror and they're like, damn, I look good, right? And it actually changes your perception, right? It changes how you interpret your body. Reduces anxiety, so on and so forth. All right. So motivational fuels. Okay. So for motivational fuels, like how do people stay motivated when they set their New Year's goals, right? One, incredibly important. Of all of these four, this is the most important. Enjoyment. People must absolutely enjoy what they're doing, right? So when I'm working with clients and people say like, what should I do to lose weight? What should I do? Blah, blah, blah. And it's very generic, but it's true. Find something you love. You know, people say, oh, should I come to the gym? Should I do this? Should I do that? Like, I don't know. Do you like to do Zumba? If you love to do Zumba, go do Zumba. It's something to keep you more active, but you have to enjoy it. Otherwise, you are much less likely to adhere. Number two, competence. Develop. So I'm speaking to coaches here. This could be personal trainers, but competence is very, very important, right? Um, if somebody has this perception of their competence as they're terrible at something and they're never going to get good, why are they going to keep coming back? Sure, you might have somebody that's very determined, but if somebody just sees themselves as being this terrible, unsuccessful, incompetent person at a specific sport or exercise, right, they're not going to come back. So like for me, right, or for you guys, when you get out there and start coaching, especially youth and physical education, it's so important to have this positive approach towards coaching, right? You can't just go out there and say, oh, you're terrible, you got to get better, you got to get better. That is the opposite of my approach. You give constructive criticism to improve things, know when to pull people aside to give the constructive criticism. That's a big one. For a fifth or a sixth grade boy or girl, think about how they're going to feel if you're in the middle of a field or court screaming at them these negative things. If you have negative things to say and you think it's appropriate, it might be best to simply pull them aside, because you don't want to impede their perceived competence. Autonomy kind of goes with competence, where you have this feeling of control over oneself and actions. So somebody could think that they're terrible, right? But if they feel that they have control of their self and their actions, they might have this better ability or they might have this improved perception that they can improve their competence. Okay. And then relatedness, working out in groups, so this is a major reason why CrossFit, in my opinion, has been so successful. And that's because they've developed this great system, right, of relatedness. So you go to a CrossFit, people call them a cult, whatever, right? They have this very successful group workout mentality, which, my gym, because we're more athletes, I've never been able to replicate, right? It's could be 20, 30 people in a room doing the same workout, cheering each other on. Oftentimes they're not even worried about the clock, right? You show up to the gym on a Tuesday at 5 a.m. because your workout team, your workout crew is always there. So relatedness, right, is incredibly important. Arousal and anxiety. All right, so we got a lot to talk about. So for arousal, like in terms of simple definition, we're looking at a state of bodily energy or physical activity and mental readiness. All right. With regards to arousal, is you have to think of it existing on a continuum. All right, and the book has a picture of it. It's the inverted U. Most of you should be familiar with this, right? In terms of you have this low level of arousal, indicates typically a low performance depending on the sport. As you become more in the zone, so to speak, right, and aware of what's going on, right, your performance gets elevated, right? You hit this optimal arousal zone, right, within that perfect stage or perfect spot on that continuum. It's peak performance. But if you get too focused, too fired up, right, as we come here, performance starts to decline on that inverted U. And if you'll see some people so psyched up so psyched up before a big championship game. They might have a terrible performance, and it was because they were too fired up and they weren't in that optimal zone, right? Um, so arousal states produce anxiety, and it's important that we don't confuse anxiety with stress. Anxiety can be a good thing, right? It's this purely mental state. And then finally, optimal arousal states differ between athletes and sports. Some athletes, so if we're talking about my gym, right, I have some athletes who need to be psyched up. I am one of those people, right? I put on extremely loud heavy metal music, which I wouldn't normally listen to if I'm approaching a big 1 rep max, and I just like to scream when necessary, so on and so forth, right? I have another lifter who he, you know, maybe he'll change the music a little bit, but he just runs up to the bar, focused, and just pulls the damn bar, right? So he is very different than me. And then the optimal arousal states will differ from sport to sport. So a sport like powerlifting, where the majority of people are screaming, they're taking ammonia, like sniffing salts, right, which are legal. I don't want you to think that's like drugs or anything. They're taking sniffing salts. Some people slap each other in the face before a big lift, right? They are like way over here on the right, of arousal, right, versus a sport like golf. Like imagine, God, who's the best golfer in the world right now? Is it Dustin Johnson? I don't know. I don't follow golf as much as I should, but Dustin Johnson, Tiger Woods, who's the guy that's just driving the ball like 350 yards? I don't know, him. Imagine these guys stepping up to a putt, screaming like a powerlifter. Their caddy comes over, slaps them in the face, right? They step up to that putt. Like, that's not really the type of arousal we're looking for a golf, for a putt, right? So that kind of just sets the stage for you guys to understand that arousal differs between sport. All right. Presence of others can increase or can be negative or positive. So it kind of goes hand in hand with, like, there's certain times people like the crowd, there's certain times where people don't, right? I already talked about groups performing this like cohesive unit, right? I think I finished this with some stories. Your goal as a coach or a trainer should be to help build and nurture cohesion. Okay. For me, within track and field, right, one thing we do is one way to nurture this cohesion is we do these Athlete of the Week awards. We just give out a shirt based on performances from the past weekend, but it really has become this thing over the past few years where I bring everyone together, because there's oftentimes when you have a track and field team of 130 kids, you've got your sprinters, your distance runners, your throwers, your jumpers, where we are very segregated at times, just because we have so many kids. We have to be. But for Athlete of the Week, we always bring everyone together and we give out the awards. And it's not just our best athletes. It's some people that just might have a big personal best. It could be a kid in the mile going from 6 minutes in the mile to 5:30 in the mile. And the nice thing is that the freshmen see, because this is everyone, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, they see how tight everyone is. It's exposure to some of the other disciplines. The sprinters see what the distance runners are doing. The throwers see what the jumpers are doing. And it truly does build this team cohesion, because when I announce somebody's name, everyone goes nuts. It's just a good team building experience. All right. Now I'm going to speak to some negative team experiences. So like a negative team experience happened about a year ago for me, where I had a few athletes. I think because the slide's getting a little too long in terms of uploading, I'm going to skip the story. We got to move on. All right. So, we're at the 30-minute mark. So with regards to mental skills training, and this is a thing, there's a lot of research on this stuff, and I'm a big proponent of this stuff. Some techniques are goal setting, relaxation training, imagery and self-imagery, and self-talk. And your goal is to build confidence, build focus, and proper arousal management. You have to know where an athlete should be on that continuum. There are certain times where you should be using senses. If you're doing like imagery, right? If you're doing imagery, take as many senses as possible. Where you have someone sit them down or stand them up, whatever, right? Imagine what it's like. Close your eyes. Imagine what it's like to walk up to the starting line of a race. Imagine the sounds you hear, whether it's the starter, the other athletes, the crowd. Imagine the feeling of your feet digging into the track, how your skin feels in the air, so on and so forth, right? You have to build this image that kind of puts them in where they would be for a big event, a big race, a big game. I already went over all of these, and then I think our last slide is on choking. So, choking with regards to performance is a sudden deterioration in performance that is not physiological. It is not brought about by like overtraining. Somebody's running their best race or performing their best in a basketball game, and then a week later, right? There's just this they crap out, whatever, right? And oftentimes that sudden decrease is usually caused by an increased arousal, which causes an increase in pressure, right? So sometimes this pressure starts to force the athlete to focus on their inadequacies. And if you guys looked over your motor control slides, they go from this stage of everything being autonomous to thinking they have to control everything. For a football player or volleyball player. For a football player, it should be very natural to throw the football, to catch the football, right? It's things that they've done tens of thousands of times at the highest levels, right? But all of a sudden, if you have this increased pressure where you start thinking, damn, like my wrist doesn't really snap the right way when I got to throw this football, right? And you start thinking about it, it alters the way you actually move the football, right? And all of a sudden, that's going to affect your overall performance, right? You just have to let things happen sometimes. So I'll conclude this set of slides with just a little bit story because, again, I've worked with at this time athletes from the lowest of levels, little kids, upwards of like the best hurdler in the United States, right? The best high school boys hurdler in the United States. And that's my story. So this has now been a year ago. The hurdler, the young man's name is Emmanuel Joseph. He, 1 week prior to the New York State Championship, he broke the New York State record. It was a 33-year-old record. He was the fastest hurdler in the country. And going into the state championships, he was a large favorite. He was a big favorite, right? No one was really that close to him. There was one guy we thought could be close, and this is something where it might have been my fault where I put too much on this young man, and we had talked about it. I didn't want him to be thinking that the New York State Championships would be a cakewalk. And he goes through the trials, and he doesn't have really a good trials race, but he makes the finals, right? I think he had the fastest or second fastest time in the trials to make the finals. So that's whatever. The trials don't matter. We get to the finals. The gun goes off, and he has by far his worst start in a 55-meter hurdle race ever. 55 meters is not long. The average race is 7.2 to 7.4 seconds. So if you get a bad start, it's hard to come back. And it was his worst start by far ever, and he could never recover, and he finished second place in that race. What happened? I don't know. He ran his slowest time of the year, and that's what we would call choking, right? It was he broke the New York State record 1 week prior, so it's not like physiologically he wasn't capable of running fast, he wasn't capable of winning, right? Like, he had the fastest time of the year. He had the fastest time ever, but the performance wasn't there that day, and I put a lot on myself where, maybe I had us focusing too much on the other guy and should have just let him focus on his own race. Um, but it's something that, unfortunately, it does happen. And then you got to move on and figure out how to coach better. Okay. Um, so once again, I just want you guys to understand how important psychology is from a performance standpoint and from the standpoint of, working out. You guys as coaches, as trainers, are very powerful tools, not just from your expertise within the field of how to lose weight, how to gain muscle, of how to throw a pitch. That's not just your expertise. Your expertise has to come from the psychological side as well. And unfortunately, a lot of your training is not going to be related to that. You guys are going to have to be very diligent in progressing your psychological approach towards coaching and training. All right, that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed.